Georgetown, a garden of gold for 200 years. From the first settlement in the early 1700s until the beginning of the 20th century, Rice was synonymous with Georgetown County, South Carolina, the site of the renowned Southern rice plantations and the setting for one of the most colorful chapters in American history. Rice dominated life in the county. In fact, the history of Georgetown until the modern era is the history of its rice culture. The golden era was just prior to the war between the states. Although the rice industry survived this massive upheaval for another 70 years, it never regained its prominent role in society. Still, it is likely that no other area of the United States has ever been this dependent on one crop for such a long period of time. Georgetown County was the ideal location for rice agriculture in the United States because of the abundance of fresh water which is essential for the cultivation of rice. The quantity of water flowing down her 6 rivers, the Waccamaw, the Pee Dee, the Black, the Sandpit, the North Santee, and the South Santee is so great that the pressure of the high tide backs up the water, covering the floodplains, a situation perfect for the tidal flow method of agriculture. This method enables tides to be controlled and conditions to be regulated in order to grow rice. In 1758, a Georgetown rice planter named McCune Johnstone and an engineer named Jonathan Lucas perfected the tidal flow method, and the extremely fertile floodplains of Georgetown were immediately exploited as prime rice-growing lands. Another resource successfully exploited was the large stable slave force, which ensured availability of the hand labor necessary for growing rice. In fact, slaves made up the majority of the population in Georgetown. In 1810, almost 90% of the population of 20,000 were slaves. The institution of slavery, with so few whites owning so many blacks, was an economic necessity in this rice-growing society. Without slavery, rice growing would not have been possible or profitable, as was proven after slavery was abolished. Slaves from the Senegal-Gambia region of the west coast of Africa were especially valued in Georgetown because of their agricultural expertise in rice growing. It was their technology which made rice growing a success in America. The highest in rank among the slaves was the driver, a foreman who worked in close cooperation with the white overseer who managed the plantation. These 2 men controlled the task assignments allotted each laborer, taking into consideration age and physical condition. During planting and harvesting, all hands were expected to perform extra work. At other times of the plantation year, when laborers finished their tasks, they were free to fish, cultivate vegetable gardens for themselves, raise farm animals, and in some cases hire out to other plantation owners. Of all the positions held by slaves in the plantation task allotment system, trunk minding was of particular importance. The trunk minders helped with the construction and maintenance of the floodgates, which were called trunk docks. The job was important because if salt water flowed into the rice fields, they were useless for cultivation for several years. Almost as important were the bird minders, who kept the bobolinks or rice birds from devastating the crop. Other jobs required that the laborers be highly skilled, for plantations were isolated communities that needed to be self-sufficient. And there were craftsmen and artisans who did the beautiful woodworking found in many Georgetown plantation homes, or who crafted baskets for use in the rice culture as well as for household chores. Fanner baskets, flat baskets with small slanting rims, were used to separate the chaff from the padding of small amounts of rice. The talented basket makers of the rice era have been followed by equally talented descendants, whose craft is still practiced and sold daily on US 17 south of Georgetown. In order to plant rice, the timber growth had to be cleared. The floodplains were covered with dense cypress forests. Preparing the land in order to grow rice was an enormous undertaking which has been compared in labor to the construction of the pyramids in ancient Egypt. Dikes were built up by bringing in sand from the edges of higher land. Then trunk docks were placed in the dikes to regulate precisely the flow of water. The trunk docks were ingenious devices that worked beautifully in controlling the water level. Indeed, they could keep all water out when it was necessary that the fields be completely dry. Rice was usually planted in March or April and harvested in September or October. The cultivation of rice required that the fields be flooded and the water level kept stationary for certain times of the year, or that the field be kept completely dry at other times. In the 1850s, Georgetown, South Carolina exported more rice than any other seaport in the world. To prepare such a large quantity of rice for consumption, there were several pounding mills in the area. Rice that was threshed in a mill was rarely used as seed rice because the grain was normally cracked or otherwise injured by the process. For seed rice, the threshing was done by hand using a flailing stick. Then the winnowing house was used to clean the rice. The rice was dropped through a grate in the floor of the house, and the wind blew the chaff away. When the rice landed on the hard clay floor underneath the winnowing house, laborers swept away any dirt and remaining chaff or tailing, and only the seed rice remained. Today, only one winnowing house exists in Georgetown County. The sole survivor stands on Mansfield Plantation on the Black River. Mansfield also has retained its magnificent moss-draped live oak avenue and its laborers' quarters. The slave cabins on the rice plantations were always situated in a row near the main house. The locale was known as the street. Yield from the crop was high. In 1840, nearly one-half of the national rice crop was cultivated in Georgetown County. So it is easy to see why South Carolina was the richest state in the South at that time and the second richest state in the Union after Massachusetts. In addition to maintaining summer houses, Charleston townhouses, and their plantations, many planters also kept townhouses in Georgetown for conducting business and governmental affairs. Absent from the plantations during much of the rice growing season, they summered either at the seaside resorts of Pawleys Island or Debbie-Doo, or in the nearby dry pine barrens of Plantersville or Somerville to escape the unhealthy malarial atmosphere of the plantation. The planters did not know that the mosquito was the cause of malaria or that the production of rice in standing water was conducive to the breeding of this insect. Since it was thought that the slaves were immune to malaria, most of them stayed in Georgetown to tend the crop. Actually, many of the blacks had sickle cell anemia and hereditary disease. Though a serious illness in its own right, it made many blacks less susceptible to malaria. The laborers represented much more than just able hands for the rice cultivation. A considerable portion of the planters' capital was tied up in their slaves. When the Civil War ended, the planters were stripped of their workforce, with no compensation offered. It is true that many of the former slaves remained to work the rice plantations when a semblance of normal life resumed. However, each year labor cost more and usually produced less. During this period of despair and economic hardship on the part of the planters, the merchants of Georgetown built up their resources. The plantations, in spite of all hardships, had to be supplied with life's necessities, and the merchants often held liens on the planters' crops. The scarcity of money caused the planters to issue scrip to pay their laborers. Spent in town for food and clothing, this scrip provided the merchants with a claim against the rice crops. There is no single reason for the demise of the fabulous rice culture of Georgetown County, but rather a combination of causes. Hurricanes were always a problem for the rice planters and became a major factor in the crop's death. Between 1893 and 1911, there were 10 violent storms that took their toll. The soft, muddy soil of the area prevented the use of machinery in the cultivation of rice. Since the soil of other states lent itself to widespread use of machinery, the rice from Carolina could no longer compete successfully on the market. Rice growing in Louisiana had first been introduced in the early 18th century, but after the war between the states, it was expanded. Rice growing was undertaken in Texas in the 1880s, and in the early 1900s, the crop became commercially important in Arkansas. California started growing rice around 1912, and about 50 years later, Mississippi followed. These 5 states today produce almost 95% of the rice crop in the United States. So it was that all these factors contributed to the demise of the Georgetown County rice culture, which began to collapse after 1911. By the 1930s, all commercial rice production had ceased. An entire civilization had vanished. The Garden of Gold was gone. But the legacy of the rice era lives on at the Rice Museum, which was opened on May 18, 1970, as Georgetown's contribution to the South Carolina Tricentennial. Located in the carefully restored Old Market Building, the Rice Museum and its collections are held in trust by the Georgetown County Historical Commission. The Old Market Building, also known as the Town Clock, has since become the symbol of Georgetown County and was the first Georgetown structure to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. As early as 1788, the site on Front Street, at the foot of Screven Street, had been the location of the Old Market. The Market Building is a brick and stucco structure upon a high arcaded base. This brick structure replaced an earlier wooden one. When in 1841 fire destroyed the Front Street business district between Queen and Screven Streets, the old wooden market, which had sustained severe damage in the hurricane of 1822, was torn down as a fire break. In 1842, the entire block was rebuilt, including the market and the adjacent Kaminsky Building, which now houses the gallery of the Rice Museum. The clock tower was added about 1845. The second floor of the structure, which now houses the permanent exhibits of the Rice Museum, was used as the town hall until just before the building was given to the Historical Commission in 1970. Carefully preserving the presence of the past, the Rice Museum stands proudly today as a monument to that time when the Garden of Gold